William Henry Harrison was the son of Benjamin Harrison V. He was the youngest son, so he was in Benjamin Harrison VI. Benjamin Harrison V was a founding father, one of the signers of the Declaration, and the fifth governor of Virginia from a long line of famous Virginians. Just to give you kind of a timepiece there, when Benjamin Harrison V left office in Virginia, he was taken over by Patrick Henry. So William Henry Harrison was famous in his own right, and even in that, added to his fame. He fought against Native Americans in the battles of the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and because of that, made a name for himself, and after that went to Congress. William Henry Harrison was the first governor of the Indiana Territory, yay, and led his soldiers against Chief Tecumseh at the Battle of Tippecanoe, where he even further made a name for himself. During the War of 1812, he defeated the British and natives at the Battle of Thames, one of the only real bright spots in the War of 1812, where the Americans did well. And then after that, moved to Cincinnati. And he was going to live a private life, but was urged to run against Martin Van Buren in 1836. So he did. He lost. But in 1840, since Martin Van Buren was doing so poorly, he ran against him again and won. It was raining on Inauguration Day on March 4th, 1840, and William Henry Harrison walked to his inauguration without any kind of raincoat or protection, and began his inaugural address this way: "Called from a retirement which I had supposed was to continue for the residue of my life, to fill the chief executive office of this great and free nation, I appear before you, fellow citizens, to take the oaths which the Constitution prescribes as a necessary qualification for the performance of its duties, and in obedience to a custom coeval with our government, and what I believe to be your expectations, I proceed to present to you a summary of the principles which will govern me in the discharge of the duties which I shall be called upon to perform." That's how he started his inaugural address, and went on for 2 hours in the rain. Well, the busy schedule of becoming president, really for the first week there, wore him down. He took a walk about a week later, and for different reasons became very sick. He wasn't used to the water coming out of the Potomac. That's what most scholars think. But that, with just a vigorous schedule and having this cold, actually ended up dying a month after that inaugural address. He was the shortest-lived president that we've ever had. And now we, of course, have the amendments that would say who would take over after the president is gone, and even the whole long line of succession, but they didn't have that figured out then at all. So his vice president, John Taylor, just assumed the presidency, and they had to scramble to find out if he was going to be the president or not. When John Taylor took over, he gave a speech just again 8 days after William Henry Harrison had died, and said this, quote, "Upon him you had conferred your suffrages for the first office in your gift, and had selected him as your chosen instrument to correct and reform all such errors and abuses as had manifested themselves from time to time in the practical operation of the government. While standing at the threshold of this great work, he has, by the dispensation of an all-wise providence, been removed from amongst us, and by the provisions of the Constitution, the efforts to be directed to the accomplishing of this vitally important task have devolved upon myself." Death brings a mixture of emotions, especially when I think back at the funerals that I've done, and I've done a lot of them. In fact, if you Google my name, most of the time it'll come up will be because of a funeral that I've done, and where I'm the officiant. I did one just not very long ago of a man that I knew, and when he died, there was a mix with the family and myself, because he was a friend, and people that were there, a mix of relief. The person had had some addictions and didn't die from those, but tried his whole life to try to get rid of those, and couldn't, and died before he got real freedom. And so there was a mix of relief but also just sort of dismay that he never kicked it, Conversely, when I went to Jeannie Pritchard's funeral, it was one of joy, and I could speak pretty lightly and make some jokes and be pretty free, because Jeannie lived a wonderful life for the Lord, and it was a graduation ceremony more than anything, just to be able to say, we are so blessed to have known Jeannie, and we're so glad that we'll see her again one day, and she is with the Lord, and we're happy for her and sad for us. But it was a different sort of funeral. Maybe for you, you've had some funerals where there's been a mixture of emotions, where maybe it's not just all sad, where there's been some just conflicting things that have happened. Maybe some siblings or a parent, a friend, any kind of complicated relationship that brings a lot of thoughts about how you felt about the person. 2 Samuel chapter 1 has a rare, what we could call funeral service, a eulogy for the dead. Now, David hears about Saul's death while he's back in burned out Ziklag. And it could have been a moment of triumph for him. So David has been on the run from Saul. He and his men haven't been able to go to Israel. In fact, because of all that, he was almost forced to fight alongside the Philistines. Because of God's intervention and everything, he didn't have to. But now that Saul is dead, David could think to himself, this is great. I don't have to be on the run anymore. We're not fugitives. God gave justice to Saul. He wasn't doing the right thing, and I'd put it in God's hands, and God finally came down and got him, and God proved that I was right and he was wrong. He could have had that attitude. He could have said, hey, now that's the final obstacle to me being king. I guess I'll just march to Gibeah and take the crown, and in fact, I have it right here. We'll look at that in a moment. But there's nothing standing in my way. I can finally be king. And David could have done that. But instead, David reacts in a way that can instruct us about our complicated relationships with others. You have those. You will have those. You have had those, and you've learned some of these things. So what principles can we learn when there's a complicated relationship that ends? How do we feel about conflicted relationships, and how do we do it without sinning, right? How can we be in a world where we aren't getting along with people, or where we're maybe even regretfully thankful that the person is gone? And how do we deal with that as believers? So let me give you some principles from this chapter in 2 Samuel chapter 1. First of all, let me say that it is right to honor an office while rebuffing the person who's holding it. You don't have to get along with the person who's in the office, but there are offices that God has set up and expects us to honor. Now, how does David hear of Saul's death? He hears about it from an Amalekite. Let's read verse 1 of 2 Samuel chapter 1. Now it came to pass after the death of Saul, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, and David had abode 2 days in Ziklag. So timing's a little funny. It took them 3 days to get there, 3 days back. They had to chase the Amalekites. Now they're back. So it's been, let's say, maybe about a week. Somewhere within that week, a short time, Saul has been killed by the Philistines, and word is kind of trickling out. But this Amalekite probably is the first to tell David what's happened. Verse 2. It came to pass on the third day that, behold, a man came out of the camp from Saul with his clothes rent and earth upon his head. He's mourning. That means things didn't go well. And so it was, when he came to David, that he fell to the earth and did obeisance. And David said unto him, From whence comest thou? And he said unto him, Out of the camp of Israel am I escaped. And David said unto him, How went the matter? I pray thee, tell me. And he answered, That the people are fled from the battle, and many of the people also are fallen and dead, and Saul and Jonathan his son are dead also. Now, just because this guy comes out and says, oh yeah, I was at the battle, doesn't mean anything. He could have been mistaken, and David marches back into Israel and finds out, no, Saul's not dead. And so he asks, How knowest thou that Saul and Jonathan his son be dead? And so the young man gives a story. Now, before I read the story, I'll just say my personal opinion is that he was lying. That what we have as the accurate representation of what happened, that Saul wounded, killed himself, and then his armor bearer killed himself, that's what we read about at the end of 1 Samuel. That's the actual account. What the Amalekite here says is fabrication. So verse 6, the young man that told him said, as I happened by chance upon Mount Gilboa, behold, Saul leaned upon his spear, and lo, the chariots and horsemen followed hard after him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me, and called unto me, and I answered, here am I. And he said unto me, who art thou? And I answered him, I am an Amalekite. And he said unto me again, stand, I pray thee, upon me, and slay me, for anguish is come upon me, because my life is yet whole in me. I'm injured, I'm going to die, but I'm not there yet, and I'd like to die before these Philistines come and start abusing me and torturing me as I'm dying. I don't want that, so please just finish me off. So verse 10, so I stood upon him and slew him, because I was sure that he could not live after that he was fallen. And I took the crown that was upon his head and the bracelet that was on his arm, and have brought them hither unto my Lord. And at this point in the story, he produces them, and David sees that's Saul's bracelet, and that's his crown. He really is gone. There's no way this man would have these things if Saul wasn't actually dead. Now, this Amalekite lies, I think, because he thinks he can get a reward. And I did a lot of thinking about this week, the way that the world thinks about things and the way that believers think about things. The Amalekite says, hey, David, he's on the run from Saul. Of course, he wants to hear good news that he's dead. And if he hears that I'm the one that finished him off, maybe there'd be something in it for me. Maybe I could get a little position or a reward of something, because that's the way normally it works. In the world's economy, if you can do a favor for the next guy who wants to be king, if you can stab him in the back, poison him, whatever, if you can do that to the king, maybe the next guy will thank you for it. Maybe he thought that. We don't know. But David instead chided him and had him executed. Verse 11, then David took hold of his clothes and rent them, and likewise all the men that were with him, and they mourned and wept and fasted until even for Saul and for Jonathan his son and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they were fallen by the sword. And David said unto the young man that told him, whence art thou? And he answered, I am a son of a stranger, an Amalekite. And David said unto him, how wast thou not afraid to stretch forth thine hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? And David called one of the young men and said, go near and fall upon him. And he smote him that he died. And David said unto him, thy blood be upon thy head, for thy mouth have testified against thee, saying, I have slain the Lord's anointed. Now that's not what he said. He said, Saul was dying, and so I killed him. But David, in his mind, says, you dare to touch the Lord's anointed. God anointed Saul, and you think you can just come upon him and kill him, even if he was dying? That was the wrong thing to do. God has instituted offices that we are called to submit to and honor. And we all recognize that not everybody that inhabits those offices are worthy of that honor. Parents aren't perfect. They treat us in the wrong way. They don't lead well. They make it sometimes about them. They take advantage of us in a wrong way. And as you think about your own parents, maybe that's true for them, that they just weren't what they needed to be. And yet God calls us to honor our father and mother. Maybe you have an employer who's harsh, and they haven't treated you fairly. They've expected too much, and they've paid you too little. They've asked and asked, but not given very much. They've undercut you. They've made it a hostile working environment, and you're still there because maybe you can't find another job, or because you feel like that's where God has you, and God calls us to submit to our employers. There are leaders in government, and I don't need to tell you this, that are corrupted, that are self-interested, and that are unjust. To hear their proposals of what they want to do is enough to say, well, that's exactly the opposite of what I want in this country. And whether they have a lot of people saying, yes, this is a good idea, or what's more likely, just a few people that are saying this is what we should do, we don't like that. And yet we are called to submit to those in authority and to not speak evil of dignities. Now again, God knows all of this. He knows the role that your parents have played, employers, government officials. He knows all this, and he does not make exceptions for us to submit and honor to them. Paul calls us to submit to government entities in Romans 13, verses 1 and 2. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. Paul is talking about Rome. Even though Paul was a Roman citizen, he didn't get a vote in who was the next Caesar. Nobody did. Maybe the senators had some influence, but I think because in America we think of our government leaders as sort of being elected by us because they're sort of still part of kind of us. You know, we tend to like Congress people and presidents who can identify with our everyday life, and so I think because it gives us an understanding of, well, we still have some power over this person, and that's true in America. For the most part, isn't it true? I mean, in the last election, there was 150 million people that voted. You know what that means? There's 150 million people who didn't vote. You know, there's a lot more power in a voting bloc than we think. And we think in those terms, and so we think because we have a say in the government that we are free to criticize unfairly or unchristianly, in an ungodly sort of way, and not submit to the authorities that were there. This was really tested during COVID, wasn't it? We're like, where's this line between, all right, this is what I'm being told to do, and yet this is unjust, and there is something where I am not going to submit to unjust laws. What I'm saying to you is that there is an office that God calls us to submit to, and it's not always an easy thing to do. Peter instructed us to obey our employers, and he says, yes, even the wicked ones. He says in 1 Peter 2:18, servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward. Now again, you say, well, that's in the context of a slave-master relationship. Yes, and how much more when you as a Christian in a New Testament context are in a position where you are an employer, an employee of someone. How much more are we to submit in that way? Right? You had to submit before, but now as an employee, you are called to submit as well. Children are called to honor their parents with no caveats. Right? And I understand, well, I can think of exceptions. What I'm saying to you is that you can honor the office while still not loving the person who's inhabiting that office. And that's what I see with David and Saul here. David was no friend of Saul's. I mean, he wanted to have a good relationship. It could have been that David would have said, hey, this is great. Saul wasn't doing the right thing. He was using his power to do all kinds of wicked things. He killed a whole city of priests. So good, I'm glad that he's gone. But David instead said, that was God's anointed. That was an office that God set up, and you had no right to do what you did. You say, well, Pastor Hahn, that sounds great, except I'm looking at my leaders. I'm dealing with a boss. I have parents that I struggle to honor. So how can I do this? First of all, I think with the right expectations. The government, leaders, your parents, your employers cannot bring you joy. That's not their job. And when they offer to do it, I say, no thanks. Now, I want to bring my children joy, but I want them to find joy in the place you can only find joy, which is in the Lord. Right? It is not their task to bring us joy. And so why do we expect them to do more for us than what they're called to do? That's, we can say this, right? Part of the problem. Everybody wants someone else to fix my problems. That's an undue burden. And when you put an undue burden on a power, they will take that and they will go further than you intended for them to do with that power. It is right for us to say, these are the people in place in these offices, it is right to look past them to the Lord and his sovereignty and his character. I believe in getting involved in what you can in your job. If there's anything you can do to make your work situation better, if there's anything you can do to get involved in politics, I'm involved in it. Do what you can. Work hard. But all of that should be flowing from a trust in the Lord, not from an expectation that life will magically change if we just do a little bit more, because that's not the point. God calls us to submit to the authorities in our lives just because it's the right thing to do. So manage your expectations a little bit. Second, you can do this with the right understanding. God is not condoning sin. He's not saying, well, yeah, people are going to sin, so it's fine by doing that. What he says is, yes, people are going to sin, and you have to understand that is a part of it. When Peter says you have to submit to your masters, even the froward, he's recognizing there are some masters that are wicked. There are some people in high positions that are evil. Your parents are going to do things that are wrong. They're going to sin against you. And again, yet, you are still called to honor the offices. Those in our relationships are our intersections with the world. And those intersections, because we're in the world, are corrupted by sin and in need of our influence. And God wants to use us. So we need the right understanding. How can I honor the office even as I don't necessarily agree with what's going on? I can do it with the right expectations for them, for me. I can do it with the right understanding that sin is a part, it's baked in to the world we're living in. And 3, with the grace to obey. It's okay to say, I cannot do this in my own power. I cannot obey my parents without the Lord's help. I can't be a faithful employee and respect my boss. I cannot not speak evil against those who are in power and government officials, especially when I see all the nonsense that they're doing. I can't think of them in the right way. Yes, but God can, and when you cry out to him, he can help you to obey and honor those positions. I think it is good for us to say, I will honor the position even as I really rebuff is the word I used in my notes. I was going to use despise, but I feel like that's probably too hard. However, the complicated relationship is between you and the office, who's in the office. God calls us to have the right and Christian perspective. Second principle is this, that it is okay to overlook the faults of a person. What David says then, what he goes into, and Dan read most of this, is, again, a bit of a eulogy. And the way he's talking, you think, are we talking about the same person? You're talking about Saul, right? Saul the king, the tall guy, right? That's who you're talking about? And yet the way David talks about him isn't, again, in a flattering sort of way, like the way that people in power talk platitudes about one another, but they really despise each other. That's not what I believe is going on here. He says this in verse 17, David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. Also he bade them teach the children of Judah the use of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. Here's what David says, the beauty of Israel is slain upon thy high places. How are the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath. Publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. Ye mountains of Gilboa, that's where Saul died. He died in the mountains of Gilboa. Let there be no dew, neither let there be rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty is vilely cast away, the shield of Saul, as though he had not been anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. David did not bring out Saul's faults and evils, but he rejoiced in his triumphs. Saul was a leader who had a shield, and he was mighty, and he went out and he fought for our country. Saul had had victories, and David was thankful for that. He had helped Israel be rid of the Philistine threat on many, many occasions, and he had not shirked his duty. He went out with the men to fight and died there on the battlefield. He called him the beauty of Israel and the mighty. lest we think that David was somehow deceived, or somehow he didn't really know the real Saul. If there's anybody that did, it was David. There's a temptation whenever I do a funeral to whitewash the person. I made this joke at Jeannie's funeral. There was a man who had been a wicked man, and his wife and his widow and his orphaned son were sitting there. And as the preacher talked about in glowing terms this man that had died, the mother leans over to her son and said, "Go check to see if that's your dad in there." Right? There's just this temptation to always have to say the nice things about somebody, right? Mark Antony in Julius Caesar. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is often interred with their bones. So let it be with Caesar. I'm tempted sometimes to feel dishonest about the way that I'm talking about this person, but you can't think of people in one color. It's true that I've done some funerals for some people that I'm not sure are in heaven, and some that don't have, that ended their lives in some really tragic way. Again, with some people saying even there's a little bit of relief there. But we all understand that there were moments of our life, like think back to your life, and if somebody had taken a snapshot of your life, and that was your whole story, and they said, this is who this person is. Now, maybe it was more than a snapshot. Maybe it was years and years of videotape. What I'm saying is not that there's good in people, but that there is enough good for us to be thankful for and to, at some point, overlook the faults of those people. It is good to learn to let go what happened in the past and to think differently about the person that you're in a complicated relationship with. David was able to speak to the good while in a large part overlooking the bad. That's not an easy thing to do. Some of you have been really, really hurt by people, and you have broken relationships that not only will never be mended, but you don't want them mended, and that's okay. But it's also okay to forgive the person. It's also okay to think about them in a different sort of way, where you can pray for them, where you can wish good for them, and not just because it benefits you, because at this point maybe it wouldn't. It's okay for you, especially if they're gone, to have a spirit of forgiveness. A parent who abused you, someone who betrayed you in the past, and they're no longer here, and you can't go talk to them, and you can't ask for their forgiveness. And maybe if they were alive, they would give it, but maybe they wouldn't. And you still have an opportunity to forgive and to look past those things. You say, I just don't think that I can do that. I can't help but be upset by, again, politicians, and be angry at former bosses, and be hurt by a spouse, a parent, a family member. It hurts too much for me just to say, I'm done. But let me give you some principles even for that. First of all, you can, by the right perspective, acknowledging God's sovereignty. We talked about this in Family Sunday School this morning, but Joseph, at the end of his life, didn't say to when his brothers came and they said, hey, dear old dad said that you should forgive us. Joseph was already there. He said, listen, I know that you meant this for evil all those many years ago, and it had been many, many years by that point. He said, I know that you meant it for evil. You had hoped maybe that I was going to die in slavery, but let's just both thank God that he allowed you to do this, because if it hadn't been for God's sovereignty and your actions, we wouldn't be here today, and I wouldn't have been able to save your life. That is a perspective that's not very easy to be able to say, right? You don't know what kind of life you would have had with different parents, right? You don't know what kind of choices could have been made had you had a better boss at this point in your life. Thinking back to our nation, what kind of nation would we have had if the 2008 election had gone differently, or the 2004 election had gone differently, right? We just say God is sovereign, he is in control, and not to brush it off, but to have the perspective of, all I know is that God is good and that he intends good for me. So whatever has happened, God meant it for good in my life. He knew it would all happen, and he intended to build me even over top the sins of others to bring me to the point I am now. Now, my job is just to not waste those things that have happened to me in bitterness and anger and hurting others because I was hurt. I cannot waste these trials on sin. So my perspective is that I'm going to maybe lament those things, but thank God for them. I can with the right perspective. God can use it in writing your story, and he wants you to trust him. One of the songs that we sing in the hymnal is There Is a Fountain. It's written by a man named William Cowper, but he also wrote a song called God Moves in a Mysterious Way, and it goes in part like this. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds ye so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. I can do this with the right perspective. I can overlook the faults of others with the spirit of forgiveness. To forgive is to overlook, to act as if it didn't happen. You're going to be offended in this life. You're going to be sinned against. And let's be honest, you've also sinned against others. And when you've gone to those people to ask them for forgiveness, and I hope you have, you're hoping that they have the spirit of, I have already in my heart forgiven you. Thus, knowing how good that feels and knowing that that's the right thing, we ought to carry that attitude with us as well. To be able to say, I will not act on this in a wrong way. I will take the good of what has happened to me, even in this sin against me, and I will leave the hurt behind. I believe what David did was to say this: I'm thankful for King Saul. I learned so much in his kingdom. And when I was in his court, he took me into battle and he gave me an opportunity. And he was a good man. And I'm so sorry that an evil spirit came upon him. But all those things that he did wrong can be forgiven and overlooked. And I'll take the good that God used in my life. Even in his sin, I'll take the good that came into my life and thank God for that. You can also have this perspective, this attitude, with a desire to overcome bitterness. When we've been sinned against, when we have a complicated relationship with somebody like David did with Saul, there's always this temptation to bitterness and to let that fester and to say, I just this person, they've done me so wrong that I'm never going to be better. I'm never going to be different. And this is just the way and I have the right to hang on to this forever. And it may be that you have in America a right to be bitter. There's all kinds of rights that people say we have in America that we just don't have or just aren't the right things to have. You cannot hold your offenses forever, especially when the person is gone, and you cannot ask them for forgiveness. But you can ask God to help you come to a point of acceptance. The danger is that if we let bitterness set in, it will eat at us, not the other person. I had to come to this point. I've had periods of bitterness in my life where it's been very easy for me to hold a grudge. I mean, it's like it's not, I'm not holding a grudge. It's just the grudge is glued to me. I don't have to grab it that hard. It's just with me all the time. You know, there are certain people that when I think about them, there's just this pain, and I just think, oh, God, I hope that you do something about that. And I realized at some point that was in my own heart. And I realized the danger of that. Because what Hebrews says is that bitterness is like an infestation that will start to eat at me, and others will be defiled. Not generally the person that I'm bitter at. You're bitter at somebody else, that somebody did something. You know who's feeling the effects of it? Not that person, but the people that are around you, the people that love you. For parents, your kids. For wherever you are, your friends, your family, they all see that. And you could defile others and give them the wrong perspective. Bitterness is a danger that God warns us about. It'll defile others. And so it's okay, it's good for us to say, I will forgive and I will overlook the offense. We're not saying it's okay. Oh, what that person did to me, that wasn't a sin. You don't have to say that. You can say, yeah, they sinned against me, but I'm choosing to not be bitter about this. I am choosing to think about the good and to accept the good that God brought into my life, even through their abuse and sin. That's the second principle. So the first principle is that it is right to honor an office while rebuffing the person who's holding it. The second principle is it's okay to look over the faults of a person. And the third principle is this: it's right to grieve for what was lost. It's right to be sad. It's okay to be sad for what could have been. David laments Saul and Jonathan, verse 23. Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with other delights, who put on ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? O Jonathan, thou wast slain in thine high places. I'm distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished? And David laments them, and it even says in verse 18 that he taught Judah how to play the bow, this song. Saul was supposed to be the conqueror. He was supposed to be God's chosen man, God's representative. He was supposed to be the instrument who was supposed to turn the whole nation around, going from judges to a godly, centralized person. And Saul was not that. He turned power-hungry, vengeful, self-seeking, and murderous. And I think that David's lamenting that as well. Jonathan was supposed to be next to David. Jonathan hadn't done anything wrong. He wasn't a part of Saul's campaign to find David. Jonathan didn't do anything wrong. And David's heart was for Israel and for Saul, but it was especially for Jonathan, his best friend. Jonathan had said at one point, don't worry, you'll be king and I'll be right next to you. And now David's realizing that will never happen. I'll never see him again. We'll never get to find out what a kingdom with David as the military leader and Jonathan saying, can I go smite some garrisons? Can I just go on an excursion? And David says, fine. Do you want me to go with you? Well, I don't need you to go with me. I'll just go. All right, well, let's go together. No. You stay here and do kingly things. You're getting soft. No. Let's go. We never get that story. David never gets what it would have been like to fight alongside his best friend to be in the kingdom together. And that's okay to grieve what was lost. Grief is more than just the loss of a person, right? It's more than just this person is now gone. If you've ever experienced grief, you know that that's true. It's not just, oh, there's a person who's not there anymore. It's the loss of the future and what might have been. That's why birthdays, anniversaries, special days are so hard, because you think, what would life have been like today? What would I be doing today if this person had still been here? We mourn not just the person, but all the plans and all the hopes, all the change and all the hope for better that we could have had. All those are gone. And especially when there's sin, we kind of wonder if they would have repented. I don't know what David thought about Saul. I personally don't think we'll see Saul in heaven. I don't know that that you see a witch the night before and then kill yourself the next day. I'm not sure that's real evidence that Saul is with the Lord. I'm sure there's a part of David that was hoping that Saul would have changed, that he would have said, what am I doing? Yeah, I need to abdicate the throne. I'm doing the wrong thing. I'm going back to farming and looking for donkeys. You take the kingdom, and Jonathan, you help him out, right? That would have been great, but that's not going to happen now. Sometimes God takes someone home because they won't repent. And it's a grace, I think, that God stops them before they go too far. One of his, because the Bible talks about that whenever we have the Lord's table together. We always read that where he says, many of you are falling asleep because you're not doing the right thing, especially in the context of taking the Lord's Supper worthily. He says, some of you God's had to take home because you're not doing the right thing. Some he takes regardless of their repentance. And some he gives, and to everybody, he gives ample opportunities to make things right. And there's always that question, did they? Did they make it right? You want there to be some kind of deathbed, I'm sorry I did this, I shouldn't have. If I had it to do all over again, I would have done it differently. But you always kind of wonder, and it's okay to grieve when the person is lost. When we mourn, we lament that things weren't different. It's okay to mourn and say, my parents weren't what they should have been, what I'd hoped for, what I would have wanted. You can take that and channel it into being a better parent for your children and your grandchildren. Parents, it's hard to think about a boss, a spouse, a friend who died when they were angry with you because it leaves you unfulfilled. You can mourn that. It's okay to say, I really wish that had been different. So what do we take from the loss of others? Gratitude, first of all, for their peace in our lives. I'm thankful that God gave them to me so that I could learn what I needed to learn. What you have been shaped by the good that God has done, the good that God has done to you in others. You've also been shaped by the sins that other people have done to you. And that's okay. You can thank God for the way that he, in wisdom, has used all of that for good. You can thank God for his wisdom in leading you. You can be thankful for even the contribution. The sermon is called The Death of a Soldier, and this is, again, it's interesting that one of the only funerals in the Bible is about a soldier that died in battle. We can be thankful for the contributions that have been made on our behalf, even for people that we'll never meet. We also can take from the loss of others perspective for what God has done for us. David had anticipated in 1 Samuel 26 that this would happen. Remember, he said to Abishai, no, we're not going to kill him. His day will come. He'll fall in battle or something will happen to him. So David anticipated that this happened, and God now paved the way. In Psalm 90, verse 12, then, that teaches us. He says, teach us to number our days that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. With that perspective of saying, yeah, I don't have as much time to make right the things that I need to as well. Ephesians 5:16, redeeming the time because the days are evil. We get 8,760 hours every year. How are we spending them? When we think about what others have done and how they have failed, that should be motivational for us. And finally, there's a warning here about throwing away our life. When we look at other people and what they have done and the loss that was there, that motivates us to not follow in their footsteps. David is going to sin later with Bathsheba, and it's interesting what he writes in Psalm 51 are these words, cast me not away from thy presence, and take not thy Holy Spirit from me. You know what he's saying? Don't do to me what you did to Saul. Lord, I sinned, but I'm not rebelling against you. I don't want you to take your presence away from me like you did Saul. Saul was hard-hearted, and this was a moment for David to at least take warning. He didn't want the same path as Saul. In fact, last week when we preached out of Psalm 18, verse 36 says, thou hast enlarged my steps under me that my feet did not slip. Now, it's sad that others might be a warning for us, but we can avoid being that for others, and we can look on others and take that warning. There are some principles, even from a story like this, where David is thinking about his relationship with Saul and how everything happened. There are some principles here that we can take for ourselves. And I'm hoping that God can do some comforting, helping, healing work in you here this morning.